Welcome to She Said Homestead, the podcast that explores homesteading from a range of perspectives. We're Sage and Mickayla, two homesteaders, each with unique experiences, properties, and future goals for our homesteads. We're discussing various homesteading topics, sharing our personal experiences as women working full-time who are managing homesteads as well, and shining a light on the stories of other inspiring homesteaders.
Before we dive in, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. And if you enjoy our podcast, please consider leaving a review. It really helps us grow and share these homesteading stories with even more people.
Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Mickayla from Calico Cow Acres.
And I'm Sage from Terra Nova Acres, and we both have homesteads in Western North Carolina.
Today we are going to be talking about how to cook with what you grow. But before we get into the topic, why don't you tell me about your week?
This week, so when we're recording this, the last week was 4th of July. And so it was an unordinary week because I had a little bit more time off of work and I got to see family a little bit too. But this is also wineberry season. And so there's like a week window where I can go in and do, a couple different harvests because they get ripe really fast, but they also get eaten really quickly. And so I usually go back there in my woods, a few times and grab what I can grab and try to get enough to do a batch of jam. I think it's technically jam. Sometimes jam versus jelly gets fuzzy, but anyway, I like to get enough to do a batch of jam that lasts me the year to use, on toast, or I also like to use it in my dressings. Sometimes it's really, really good with balsamic. But that's cool. I feel like that kind of snuck up on me. That's always something that I have in the back of my mind, but I'm like, wow, okay, we're really in summer now. If my garlic is out of the garden and I'm pulling in summer squash and the wineberries are here, like, okay, I better enjoy it because I feel like I'm going to turn around and it's going to be gone. But I also got out finally onto the Blue Ridge Parkway for the second time this year, and did a hike, which is something I really enjoy, but is something that I don't usually have time for. So that felt really good. But to have both the dogs on a hike with me is probably not something that I'm going to do again. Luckily, Copper's great off leash and he was listening really well. And that's the only way that we all made it up and back down the mountain in one piece. So I think for future adventures, Athena will stay home and Copper will go with me because Athena just doesn't have the endurance. She's so big, she's so fluffy, she gets hot so quickly that she's just not a hiking companion dog, and that's okay.
Are the wineberries wild in your forest then?
They are invasive, so they're not naturally here, but I did not plant them. So, yeah, they're wild, and I do really enjoy them. I'm not going to go out of my way to get rid of them, even though they're invasive, because they're so delicious. They're basically a raspberry, for anybody who's not familiar. But you don't typically see them sold because they don't store well. They don't have the storage ability of a normal raspberry. So I pretty much have to immediately put them in the freezer or else they start to turn mushy and go bad pretty immediately.
Because we don't have those here, but we do have dewberries, which are also like an invasive blackberry, and they're not technically native. I don't think anyway. I'm pretty sure they're not. Every acre of our property that isn't forest, that's basically dewberries, and they're delicious, and they're wild blackberries basically. And I also have to get them right into the freezer. But it was so dry in June that we didn't get, like, they shriveled up within a few days, and I only got to eat them in the morning, a few mornings, and then they were done. Like, I didn't get to harvest any of them this year because it was so dry.
Another exciting thing is that I pulled my first non-cherry tomato. So I've gotten a sun gold cherry tomato out of my garden to this point, but I pulled my first Romas today, which is exciting. Again, it makes me feel like, wow, okay, it's really summer. And now I'm thinking I better prepare for getting everything preserved because it's switching from the chaos of getting everything planted to now like It's about to be the chaos of preserving season. So it's honestly a really good time to talk about how to cook with all of this stuff because got to do it at some point.
I also pulled my first Roma today. I feel like we can celebrate. We should have, I don't know, we should have something to celebrate with. So cheers with my water. That's exciting.
And my nothing. What about you? Other than pulling your first Roma, what have you been up to?
It has been a weird week with the 4th of July being on a Thursday and then working the next day and then having the weekend. My week has felt really off. We went and saw fireworks Friday night. I think it was Friday night. And that was cool. We hadn't been to see fireworks in like years because we've been moving and doing all the things and just haven't made time for it. So that was nice to go sit in the downtown park and watch fireworks for once. Turns out I did plant a shishito pepper plant on accident in my garden. I meant to, thought I had forgotten, mislabeled it, and then realized a couple days ago in the garden that I had shishitos growing, and I was very, very excited. So we had our first blistered shishito snack. Our little chickens that we got in February started laying their first eggs over the last week or so. And so we've been getting a whole boatload of little fairy eggs, and a lot of them are green. We got like a dark olive one, and I was not expecting that, so I was pretty excited. But they're literally the size of like ping pong balls. They're so tiny and they're so cute. Every time I see one, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is the cutest little egg I've ever seen. Saturday, we went to town to go run some errands. This is the most off-topic thing I might ever say on this podcast, but we were going to Harbor Freight to get something, and the community college here has like this massive pond, like drainage pond thing. It's like a small lake. It's huge. And we noticed that there were jet ski races, like jet ski competition. And so we went parked and we were like, we have to check this out. This is the weirdest thing I've ever seen. And it was so cool. We had no clue what was happening. And so we went and parked on the campus and like walked down and watched jet ski racing for like an hour, just standing there with our coffees because we were like, this is wild. That was not in the plans, but I thought it was really fun. And now I want to go to another one sometime because it was super interesting to watch. Didn't even know that was a sport. And then later that day, I got a really big shade cloth and put it over my entire garden, like the tomato area. It's like a 20 by 20 or 20 by 30 or something. Like I have it tied to my trellises and stuff. So that's been very, very nice to be out in the garden underneath that because it's been like real feel 107 out there. I got sunburnt putting that up. It was so hot. The last thing was Edith was sitting on her eggs, and she had 4 of them we had marked. I think I mentioned that. And she was sitting on them for a few days. She was doing great. And then the next morning, I was like, where'd all the eggs go? There's only 1 egg in here, and it's not one of the marked ones. And so they were kind of taking a pause from laying, and then those eggs disappeared, and we're like, okay, it had to have been something took them because they weren't crushed in there. And you had said it was probably like a snake or something. I thought it was probably a raccoon or a skunk because we have skunks like crazy here. Like they're all over the place. It's kind of scary to go out there at night because I'm like, I'm going to get skunked sometime. Our little friend Anton the skunk. Turns out it was a snake. You were correct. And it was a big freaking snake. We went to go close them up the other night and it was pouring rain that entire evening, which thank goodness it finally rained again. All the ducks were out playing in the rain, and we go to close them in their little duck cabinet, and there's just the entire thing was taken up by this snake. Like, this snake was this thick. Like, I'm not even joking. It was massive. I know you can't see this, the people that are listening and not watching on YouTube, but it was like a really, really big rat snake. And I have seen, I think, 8 or 9 snakes on this property ever, and 4 or 5 of them I saw in the last week. So, not a fan of that. I know that snakes are good, but I'm just really, I don't enjoy, snakes and spiders aren't my thing. I don't want them near me. They can be nearby, just not, I need to not know they're there. We tried to get the snake out of there, and I was like, Okay, herd the ducks back out of the run, close the door, get it out of there. Taylor's like poking it with some stuff and like trying to get it to leave. And it just comes out and it slithers right under their little duck cabinet. And I didn't realize that the entire underneath wasn't hardware clothed in. It's only hardware clothed on 3 sides so Taylor can clean it out. I didn't realize it. I thought it was fully closed in. Basically, they had bunk beds with a snake for who knows how long. And we were like, all right, the next day we got to start collecting eggs every morning and not being lazy about it. Sometimes I'll just collect them at night. And we went to go try and get the snake out from underneath the next night, and it just wasn't there. So hopefully he left for good, but I don't think he did. So I'm expecting to go out there tonight and find him back out there because I forgot to get the eggs again this morning. And that's my life story on the snake.
I also have a black rat snake that is also eating my eggs, and I've had one every summer since I've been here. I had to get rid of the one that was here last year because it started to go after my chicks, and I'm happy to, you have your space, I have my space. If I just see you but you don't hurt my animals, we're fine. But the minute that you attack my animals, like, you lose your privilege to stay here. So I had to get rid of that one, but there's a new one this year, and so far we've been good. Like, yes, it's annoying that sometimes they get to the eggs, but my perspective is like, I pay you for protection from the not so great snakes. So if it costs me a couple eggs every week to keep the copperheads and the rattlesnakes farther away, I'm good with that. But I was coming down the hill, so there's a hill between the pasture and my house. They're on like 2 different levels. So I was coming down, and I walk past that like, I don't know, a dozen times a day. And, if I'm back in the woods or if I'm in tall grass, I'm paying attention to where I'm stepping, and I'm kind of shuffling and making sure I don't step hard or like take really big strides. But down this hill, I just don't think about it. And I stepped on something. I was like, oh, that was a weird squishy stick. Like, huh. And I looked down and I was like, oh my God, that's the snake. Like, oh my God. The I don't even know what the word is for that feeling that just happens in your brain when you just have that like vagal reaction to it. Nope, not a fan. And so today I've been very, very conscious of where I'm stepping and going slow and not just blowing through there. So I feel you on the snake bit.
I have the same thing. I'm being like extra cautious everywhere I go now because I don't want to step on this snake. And I know it's not the only one that we have by the garden because there are 2. We found 2 the other, like earlier this week, up at the top of the garden, which they could be the same snakes, but there were 2 of them up there at the same time. And so now when I like go to collect the eggs in the duck coop, they always lay them in the back corner. So I'm like standing as far away as I possibly can and like reaching down in there, like just in case this freaking snake comes out and like says hi. I don't want to have a greeter.
There's nothing worse than going to collect eggs and coming face to face with a snake. It just, it's so jarring. All right, I don't know about you, but I would much rather talk about food than snakes. So let's move on and start talking about how to actually cook and make meals out of the things that you're pulling out of your garden. I almost feel like there are 2 different distinct scenarios here. There's the small garden where you're pulling in, small random harvests, and then there's the big garden where you have these large volumes and especially all at once. And I've had both. I've lived both and felt like I've had a hard time cooking with the harvest from both. So I want to start with the small gardener harvesting, a couple tomatoes here and there, a few peppers here and there. What do you do when you don't have enough, vegetable harvest to make a full meal out of? How do you make the most out of that?
I feel like even if you have a big garden, there's still a phase of time every season where you're pulling in just like a little bit at one time too. And that's kind of where I've been the last month or so. I've been getting a pepper or 2 peppers, or a couple green tomatoes, and just a bunch of random little things like that. I'm not gonna lie, sometimes that stuff gets set on the table and slowly rots away. Or I set it on the table and one of my cats likes to bat it around, and so yesterday I found a random cucumber sitting in one of our like chairs underneath the table, and Tomatillo is just like in the corner of the kitchen because she just likes to smack things around. So sometimes the little harvests in our kitchen just have a slow demise. I try to avoid that though. So like the shishitos that I was talking about earlier in this episode, a lot of the times with that kind of stuff, I'm going to use it at all. I just try and eat it right away. Whether it's like a couple cucumbers, I'll have it as a snack. The shishitos, I just like put a little bit of olive oil or whatever in a cast iron and blister them really quick with some salt. Anything that's going to take me like 10 minutes or less, and then those things don't get wasted. That's the ideal way to use small harvests, in my opinion, just because then I don't have to think about it later.
Eating it as a snack immediately or, relatively quickly is definitely the easiest thing for me, because I also struggle with that, where you have good intentions, you put it in the fridge to save it for later, and then you get back to it and you're like, oh right, you are now wilted and I don't want to eat this. So as I'm harvesting it, and if I only have a couple here and there, I'm probably just going to eat it as a garden snack right then and there, because then I also don't have to carry it down to the house, and it's just one less thing to do, right? So I totally get that. The other thing that I'll do, if I can actually make myself follow through with it, is, those smaller things that maybe wouldn't lend themselves to a meal, or if I don't want to, quote unquote, dilute them, by putting them into a meal with a bunch of food that I didn't grow. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it just kind of feels defeating sometimes. You can turn that into an appetizer. It doesn't have to be this full meal thing, right? You can still cook it and make it into something, but still keep it in that smaller quantity. So, if you only have a handful of tomatoes, you can turn that into caprese. That is always delicious. If you only have, a handful of cucumbers or maybe a couple radishes, you can quick pickle that. We actually just gave you guys a recipe for that in our summer seasonal eating, and that's something I do all the time.
A lot of the times I'll take like a handful of green beans out of the garden or take a pepper off of the plant, and you can just saute or roast some green beans as a side with whatever you're making for dinner. That is something that we plan to do a lot. Is I'll have a main dinner planned, and then like the side for dinner is written down as whatever I need to pull out of the garden that day. So like I'll literally write that in my notes from my meal plan so that I remember to go out to the garden and actually like pull that out of there. So it's like a meal plan, but it's a flexible one, if that makes sense. So roasted peppers, sauteed green beans, whether it's like, I guess springtime, it could be asparagus or peas, or if you wanted to do fried green tomatoes, sometimes I'll make like quick little baked jalapeno poppers. Those are all really good little sides to go with dinner.
And there is nothing wrong with, if you have a couple tomatoes, there's nothing wrong with going to the store and getting more tomatoes that you can make a larger recipe. I just sometimes feel a little heartbroken when I do that, because if I worked so hard to plant whatever it is and harvest whatever it is, I kind of want to, keep it keep it in its precious form, and not combine it with other store-bought produce. But if you don't have that same mental block, then go for it and incorporate those vegetables into a larger recipe and supplement where you need with items from the grocery store. That works great too.
I'm not saying this is logical whatsoever, but I also have that same issue. And it's like so bad that like if I have a cucumber where it needs to be picked, but I'm not in the position where I can eat it like within the next couple hours, like if I have a work meeting or something, I'm going to forget about it if I put it in the fridge. It's going to get floppy if I put it on the table or the counter. So I would almost rather just feed that to my chickens right away. I know that sounds ridiculous, but I'm like, I don't want to like have to make it into a larger meal with store-bought ones, or have to go to the store and get like cucumbers to supplement or tomatoes to supplement. So I definitely have the same problem. It doesn't make sense, like logically, I don't think, but in my brain, that's just how it works.
And then something else you can do if you have a smaller garden and you're just wanting to make the most out of what you're able to pull out of there, you can use the unusual parts too. You know, things like squash blossoms are great to stuff and eat. You know, anything coated in breadcrumbs and fried is pretty good. I've made that before. I haven't really done that since I have the big garden, but that's absolutely edible. There's no reason that you can't work with the sort of unconventional items as well. Another thing you can do is carrot top pesto. I've never made that, but I think you have, Mickayla, right?
I haven't made it by itself, but I made it mixed with our garlic scape pesto this year, and that was so good. I feel like sometimes the garlic scape pesto kind of still gets a little bit strong, and so it mellowed it out just enough that it's still like super fresh and garlicky, but it's not like, oh my god, I have garlic breath for the next 72 hours. Even if I brush my teeth, you know? I really liked that. I think that was a good route. I did save a whole bunch of carrot tops in the freezer to either make into pesto in the future or just use them in like when I'm making broth or stock or whatever. And so that's another thing, broth and meat stocks or veggie stocks. I save so many little bits and pieces in just like gallon bags, or I'll take a huge like pick your own size vacuum seal bag and I'll vacuum seal the top of it with only like a little bit in there, and then cut it open when I need to add more stuff to it, seal it again, and like slowly, until it's full. And then whenever it's full or whenever I'm ready to make a broth, I will put the chicken or turkey or whatever I'm doing in my roaster oven with carrot tops, garlic scape, woody bits, onion skins, that's what they're called. I cannot think of what they were called for a second. The leaves from celery, all sorts of veggie scraps that are not things that you use in typical recipes, or at least that I don't. I just try and toss them into a freezer bag, and then I don't have to think about them later. If it comes to a point where I'm like, wow, I have way too many of these, I don't need this many for broth, I will just give them to my chickens, and like then they still don't get wasted technically. So that's just my approach to it. That happens a lot actually now that we have a bigger garden. Getting a little bit overwhelmed with like when I save too many things, I do end up having to just give them to the chickens sometimes. I really do not see that as wasting it because they're turning it into eggs and compost for me. When you're dealing with the amount of produce and scraps that comes with a larger garden, it's just a little bit different than dealing with the small garden, or if you're getting produce from the store and preserving that or whatever.
Right. And in my experience, when I shifted from having a smaller garden to a larger garden, it was really overwhelming for me to deal with the amount of produce and trying to think of recipes that could use exactly what I have, because I have so much that I don't want to go to the store and, buy extra stuff just because it fits into a recipe. I want to use what I have, but it's kind of like playing Tetris. You're like, okay, I have what feels like 1,000,001 tomatoes. What on earth do I do with all of that? It's a different beast altogether.
I feel like this isn't something that gets talked about a lot, and we're going to get a little bit philosophical for a second. I think I have an easier time dealing with the large influx of vegetables and produce in the large garden in my garden now than I did in the past with small gardens, because I do have that problem, like I said, where like after I pick them, I will just set something down and forget about it completely for like a week, and then it's no good and I just have to feed it to the chickens or put it in the compost. And I think that's like a how my brain works kind of thing. Like that's just like an ADHD brain thing where I like having all of it at one time, or being able to toss it in a freezer bag like the tomatoes and then being able to deal with it all at once instead of having to constantly remember to go back back and forth, and like deal with them a million times rather than just like once or twice in a season. That is a real struggle for me. And when I just had patio gardens or a smaller garden, it's something I really struggled with. So I think I mentioned this in one of our previous episodes recently, that I give total props to anybody who's got a small garden and they're dealing with just trying to use their produce fresh. I think that's a lot harder than planning to preserve a whole bunch of it.
I feel similarly, maybe along different lines, but also still motivated by ADHD. Like, if I have 3 tomatoes on my counter, that doesn't feel very urgent. So I don't feel particularly motivated to deal with them versus if my counter is obscured by tomatoes, then I'm like, I have to deal with this because I need my kitchen back. You know, I will procrastinate things until I have to deal with them. So I think that just goes hand in hand in general with a lot of homesteading, and yeah, we're similar in that way. So with these larger volumes, when you have all of this produce that you want to use, but it can be hard to find a cohesive recipe, I like to go back to the same basic style of recipes. So there are a few things that I know I can throw together in the same meal, and you're never going to look at it and be like, this is weird. So soups are great for random vegetables. As long as it's got some broth in it. I prefer chicken broth as long as it's got some onion. It can pretty much have any other vegetable in there, including, wilted greens if you have that. It's pretty hard to put something in a soup vegetable-wise that people are gonna look at you funny. So that's always a great one. Salad is another thing. That's gonna be more for the vegetables that you prefer to eat raw. So cucumbers, obviously, any of your greens, any tomatoes that are coming in, anything that you can snack on raw. Peppers are great. And I always love stir fry. Again, that's one that it's going to be pretty hard to throw in a vegetable that is going to seem out of place. You can put almost anything in there. Maybe pumpkin would be the only thing I can think of that would be an oddball. And it's a one pan thing. You don't have to get a whole bunch of your kitchen dirty to do this. You just chop it up, throw it in there, coat it with some honey and a little garlic powder, a little sriracha if you want it, plus some soy sauce. This is always going to be good. You can also do something like a pasta primavera. You have your pasta base, and then you have whatever vegetables you want to throw in it. And then there's also tempura fried veggies. The tempura batter is really fun. It's a little bit different than normal, frying batter. It's not heavy. And that's always really, really good with a sriracha aioli, which is just mayonnaise and sriracha. So that's how I like to have my fried green tomatoes. You should totally try it. And then the last thing that I'll throw at you is that you can always chop up vegetables, throw them on a sheet tray to roast, put them in the oven at 450, and that's always great. No matter how random the harvests you have that are coming in, that's going to seem cohesive in a meal.
We always do like a sheet pan roast with whatever random veggies, and usually we have baby potatoes from the garden or potatoes that need to get used up soon, and we'll throw those on a sheet pan with like garlic, lemon pepper or something like that. And then I like to do tofu with it, but you could do chicken or like Italian sausage or brats or something. That's always super good to just toss in the oven. And we do a lot of pasta primavera style. But something else that we like to do is the Homestead version of girl dinner, and that is taking a bunch of random things that you might not think are a cohesive meal and making them your meal. And that pretty much gives you the freedom to do whatever you want with it. I personally really love doing like appetizer dinners. We actually call them appetizer dinners, not girl dinner usually. But I'll make a bunch of different random appetizers, like homemade, where, like I said earlier, poppers. I like the idea of doing tempura veggies a lot. That would be really good. Corn on the cob, green beans, roasted potatoes, anything random like that, then throwing it in with a protein or not. Sometimes we just do the veggies and random stuff. It always turns out so good. And then you always end up eating more than you think you're going to. And you're filled up. And sometimes it's more work than actually putting a cohesive dinner together. But it's fun to do sometimes.
Yeah. When I am tired and I don't want to think about what to cook, a go-to dinner for me is chicken breast, green beans, sauteed green beans, some summer squash, and sweet potato. It's very southern, but it has consistently been one of my favorite dinners for years. And so there's nothing wrong with, having your protein and then doing three sides. Like, not everything has to come together into this one single recipe. Like, you can cook things separately and just have like your meat and three veg. That is perfectly allowed. All right, so with the larger gardens, even when you have done what you can to eat things fresh, you are probably still going to have some leftovers, which is where we get into preserving things. So you not only have to think about what you're having for dinner tonight, but you have to think about how to preserve these things so you can have them for dinner 6 months from now. And that can be another challenge on top of an existing challenge.
Okay, what is your philosophy when it comes to canning things? Because I know that there are a lot of like fancy and very specific recipes that aren't like super versatile that are really good for some dinners, and then some people will go the route of doing like the lowest common denominator. Like, do you fall on either of those camps?
I like to can it in the most versatile way possible. So, for example, I would so much rather can the straight up tomatoes than to process it into like pasta sauce, because I don't know exactly how many cans of pasta sauce I'm going to want to use, or how many times I'm going to make butter chicken, or, all of these different ways. I don't just use my tomatoes for pasta sauce. And I like to give myself the freedom to be able to use that however I want to. Maybe I'm going to get sick of a recipe out of the blue or unexpectedly, and I don't want to then dread having to eat this stuff that I worked so hard to grow and preserve. But that's because I'm a picky person. So if you're not as picky as me, and you would rather do the work now and just be able to have it as kind of a homestead fast food later, I totally get that too. What do you usually go for?
It's funny because I think this is such a personal question, because I would also say I go for the lowest common denominator. Like, I want the most versatility out of everything. But for me, canning an unseasoned sauce for tomatoes is the most versatile thing, because that's how I use it the most. I don't use tomatoes in any other form than a sauce, because if I buy them from the store, I'm buying crushed tomatoes or something similar. It doesn't make sense for me to can like whole tomatoes, because I'm going to have to turn them into some form of sauce at some point anyway. So same, but different.
I will say I'll make an exception. Like last year, I had so many slicing tomatoes that I just didn't know what to do with them anymore. They're not great to just dice and can because they have so much water in them. They're better for eating fresh, but oh my goodness, I could not eat that many fresh. And so I was like, all right, I have pounds and pounds and pounds of these slicing tomatoes. What on earth do I do with them? So I did process those into like ketchup, because you basically have to turn them into tomato paste, which it's kind of mind-blowing the amount of tomatoes that go into a tiny, tiny amount of tomato paste. So purely out of necessity, because I was running out of space and running out of jars, there are times that I'll turn it into something else. And I do have, salsa canned. I do have ketchup canned. So I will make exceptions to that. But my default is the lowest common denominator.
Yeah, I think that's going to be different for everybody. For you, that's like doing the canned tomatoes is your lowest common denominator. For me, doing the sauces, but I also know, since I meal plan so specifically every week, I know roughly how many cans of or jars of salsa we're going to go through in the year. I know how much pizza sauce we're going to go through. roughly how much tomato sauce. Pretty much I get those other things out of the way where like I know how much I need for the year. And then the rest of it becomes tomato sauce, and I don't flavor it or season it at all, other than like maybe a little bit of salt and pepper, so that I can use that in a variety of different tomato sauces, whether I want to do like an Italian like spaghetti sauce or a cream sauce, or if I'm making it into huevos ranchero sauce. There's a lot of versatility there still, but it's just the lowest common denominator in terms of it's plain sauce, and it can go a million different ways from there. So it really depends on your kitchen. I also can not a lot. I'm going to do more this year. I didn't do enough last year. Some diced tomatoes because I use those in very few recipes, but there are some that I do like to use them in, where like I have a gnocchi dish that I make a lot, and I ran out of tomatoes because I made that so much the last few months. And it's got diced tomatoes in it. Sometimes I put those in like a black bean corn salsa. So I just like to have, like, I know which recipes we make the most and what kinds of tomato I need for those things. And I just try and make roughly that amount. And then the rest becomes sauce, because I feel like you can never have too much plain tomato sauce.
All right, so obviously we talk about tomatoes because that's one of the most popular things for people to preserve. I mean, I know I have 70 tomato plants in my garden. Actually, 69 since I took one out today. I ripped it out because it was diseased. So almost 70 tomato plants in my garden because I want to put away a ton of tomatoes. But there's more that you can preserve other than just that. Peppers are also another one. They are also great in salsa, which, like we talked about just now, you can can that up. They're also great to just dry, to dehydrate, and then stock in your pantry to use it in whatever recipe down the road.
The way that I like to preserve peppers, again, for the way that we use them the most, is dicing and freezing them, because in my experience, they don't really lose their texture too badly if you dice them in like a large dice. And then I always use them in cooked foods for the most part anyway, so you can't really tell the difference. I like doing that because it's really quick and simple. For like spicy peppers, I will ferment them into like hot sauces for Taylor, or I will dice them like jalapenos up into 1 jalapeno sized amounts and freeze that so that I can just pop it into a recipe whenever I need it. I also am growing Jimmy Nardello peppers, so I'm excited to do like a dried pepper to kind of like actually season things. I think that will be interesting to try because I've never grown a seasoning pepper before.
That's like all I grow.
I know.
I don't really grow or eat many bell peppers. It's all the corbachis, the nardellos, those sorts of things. That's what it is for me.
I really love cubanelles. That's kind of like in between, I would say. It's kind of like a medium between bell pepper and seasoning pepper because it's got more flavor. We're growing some Cuban bells, which are like a spicy bell, a medium spicy bell, and just kind of like in betweens this year. So I'm excited to try some different peppers this year. Another thing that you probably think of a lot when you think of preserving garden produce is cucumbers or pickles, I guess, because that's probably the most common way to preserve them. I personally am going to be making a boatload of bread and butter pickles this year because last year I did not make nearly enough. I could eat a jar at a time. They're so freaking good. They're one of my favorite things. And then something I made last year that I don't actually need to make this year is a ton of dill relish, which I think I actually have some sweet relish too. But relishes are something that a little bit of cucumbers goes a really long way with relish because you can add peppers in, you could add other things to kind of beef it up. And I have so many little jars of relish because we only go through a little bit at a time. So I feel like I have 20 jars of relish and it's going to last me like 3 years.
I'm sad that my cucumbers did not do well this spring between the vine borers diverting to them instead of my covered summer squash and the hail at the beginning of the year. Even though I kind of know that it's not going to work great, I think I'm going to try to plant some more because I was super excited to make the recipe for pickles that I made last year, which doesn't really have a name, but it's basically a copycat of Wiggles pickles, which is sweet and a little bit spicy. And I really enjoyed that. And I also do go through a decent amount of relish as well. And the thought of not having those to pull from is just sad. And I don't think I can deal with it.
I just made a sweet and spicy pickled carrot brine, and those turned out really, really good. Like, they're just ever so slightly spicy. Same with, I did eggs in it, hard-boiled eggs, and it's so freaking good. Like, I saved that recipe because I'm like, I need to make more of all of this, and I want to make pickles like that too. I wonder if they're similar. I've never had Wickles pickles though.
They're so good. I mean, totally support making your own, but if you can't, or if you just want to try them, highly recommend.
Where do you buy them? I've never seen them.
They're at the grocery store. At least, I don't know. I shop at Publix, but I think they're in like major grocery stores.
I don't really get on the middle aisles very much, so maybe that's why. Just don't see them.
I get that. That's fair. I go produce, baking, freezer, milk. And I'm out. And chocolate. Yeah. This is a critical part.
Chocolate.
You know, tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, those feel like the major ones, but there are other things that you're pulling in from your garden that you might not necessarily can. So that would be things like green beans, that would be squash, or honestly, like anything else that you're pulling in that you just have too much of. A great way to save that for later is going to be to blanch and freeze that. There's almost nothing that you can't stick in the freezer to save for later. There are, a few things that you might want to turn into a different product, like pickles. Freezing cucumbers, maybe not a great idea. But for the most part, the freezer is going to be the most versatile way that you can preserve your food, assuming that you have the real estate, that you have the space in the freezer to do so. Because I know I don't, so that's why I do these things, like can my tomatoes and dehydrate my peppers.
Summer squash and zucchini and green beans, it's a sore spot because last year I didn't get any of those from my garden to be able to preserve. We were only able to eat fresh because we got so few because of all of the rude little bugs. So if you get too many of those, consider yourself lucky because some of us are not. Something that I do get a lot of out of our garden though is herbs. And I dry herbs like crazy. I have a lot of them hanging in our kitchen right now just to air dry. You can dry them in the dehydrator or in your oven as well, or just air dry them, tie them up, lay them out on a screen, whatever you want to do. There are, I think, like solar dehydrators and stuff too if you want to get fancy with it. Or like in episode 28 of the podcast, you can infuse oils like we talked about doing with the basil. I think that is a super good way to enhance other produce that you're pulling in, especially if it's those little bits and pieces like we talked about where you're just having it as like a snack. I kind of want to try doing like the shishito peppers or something similar and like cooking them in the basil oil just to see how it tastes. I feel like that's a really good way to like elevate those little bits and pieces of your produce from your garden. We also talked about pesto earlier with the garlic scape pesto, but you could also turn the carrot tops or the basil or whatever herbs you might want to include in that into a pesto and then just keep it in the freezer or use it fresh. And then another thing that I like to do is actually have like a handful of these in the freezer right now. I just wrap them up in wax paper or parchment, is making like a compound butter with fresh herbs. You just kind of put them into small little pieces and whip them or mix them into a softened butter, and then you can freeze it. You can use it right away. I really like to use a very hefty scoop or slice of this butter on homemade garlic bread. That is really, really yummy. I usually use like an Italian blend of whatever herbs I have in my garden, a lot of basil, and then some fresh minced garlic as well. That's really yummy.
I mean, put anything in butter.
Yeah.
I'm down.
Right?
You've convinced me. And then, of course, you have your various fruits, which you can turn into things like jams or jellies, like I talked about with the wineberries. That's definitely my plan, and I need to put that on my to-do list, but not thinking about that right now. Or there's, things like apple butter. That's kind of unique to apples, but if you've never heard of apple butter, it's basically stewed down apples that are so thick that it spreads like softened butter. And it's really, really good. And I have a ton of it that I still need to go through that I made last year.
Me too. I love apple butter. So something that I forgot to mention earlier when we were talking about the small bits and pieces of bringing in produce is there are a few of these books, but this is the one I have. It's Preserving by the Pint. If you're not on YouTube, you can't see this, but I'm showing the book. And one of my subscribers actually sent me this. It was on my Amazon wish list though, and it's just it's a whole book full of recipes where you're only making 1 or 2 pints at a time. It's small bits and pieces so that you're not wasting those tiny little harvests that you're getting. And I think that is such a genius idea because especially if you have a small garden, it really helps you to get in the mindset of being able to actually put away food, even if you're only getting a little bit of peppers at a time, or you have to save up even 1 or 2 peppers at a time until you have enough for one of these recipes. So I just wanted to mention that.
I didn't know that book existed. That's pretty cool.
There are 4 of them. They're different versions. This one it basically says quick seasonal canning for small spaces. And then the other versions are called food in jars. And I think there are a couple other variations, but they're so cute. And it's a really pretty book. And they're interesting recipes too.
Nice.
If nothing else, for inspiration, it's a good book.
And this topic doesn't actually stop with the garden. For us, and I'm sure for some of you, we have other animals. So we have chickens, I have sheep for soon to be dairy, but not right now. And so I want to talk a little bit about that too. Obviously, one of the things that comes to mind with chickens is eggs, and that is an incredibly versatile food. There are a lot of ways that you can eat that. There's not only, the typical scrambled eggs, sunny side up, what you think of for breakfast, but there's things like you can turn that into an egg sandwich. You can turn that into a quiche, which quiches freeze pretty well, by the way. So you can do that for fresh eating, or you can save that for later. Pudding or frozen custard. I know you did that earlier this year, Mickayla, when you were trying to work your way through a surplus of eggs.
I used my neighbor's recipe. Meg, she made up a pudding recipe that takes 7 eggs, and I used my duck eggs, and it was such a good way to get rid of them. And I turned those into pudding pops as well. So they're little pudding popsicles. And that was even better than the pudding. You can't go wrong with popsicles. And then I think my favorite way to preserve duck eggs in particular, but any eggs will work for this, is pasta. I have so much frozen pasta downstairs in our freezer. It's ridiculous. And I'm not planning to stop making it anytime soon.
I think pasta is also my favorite way to preserve it. Honestly, that's partially because at this point it's become muscle memory for me. I know my recipe, I know how it goes, and when I have the mountain of eggs that I need to deal with, because we already talked about that's the only way that I'm really motivated, then I will just make several batches of pasta and I'll stick that in the freezer, and I will always be glad that I have that when I'm hangry and I don't want to think about what to cook and I just need to eat something.
I also feel like pasta is one of the quickest ways to preserve it if you're not rolling it all out. If you just make the pasta dough and then form it into a loaf or a round and then put it in freezer bags so you can pull it out later, that is the quickest way for me to preserve eggs, other than just cracking them into a silicone mold and freezing them. It's just, again, for me too, muscle memory. I have too many eggs. I'm all right, we obviously can't have too much pasta, so I'm going to make more pasta. and then it just goes in the freezer, and I pull it out whenever I need it, and I'm like, wow, this is a big loaf of pasta. I could eat this for 10 days straight, and I'm not sad about it.
I do have to roll mine out and, turn it into actual pasta before I freeze it. Because if I don't, then it becomes the same issue as, oh no, I have no chicken thawed. What am I going to do? So I know me, and what works better for me is to just go ahead and process it. But I do have a specific pasta roller machine thing that I've had for years. And so that makes it a lot easier than taking a rolling pin to it.
I just take it out at the beginning of the week, and then it's in the fridge. So that makes it a little bit easier for me, just like the way that we do things. I really like hearing the way that you do things because it's always different, like slightly different than the way that we do things, but it's always for a very specific reason. Like we each do them in a different way, and I feel like that's helpful for people to hear, like why you do it that certain way and why I do it this certain way.
I feel like the reasons that I do things isn't maybe necessarily something that I would advise other people to do. My reasons are sometimes bordering on, maybe we'll use the word neurotic, but hey, if that works for you, great.
But I feel like other people will probably relate to that. Like it's helpful. It's going to be helpful to somebody who also like procrastinates dinner, or they're just like too busy in their gardens harvesting things or like planting, and they're like, oh no, I got inside and I need to make dinner. I know there are other people who also have to meal plan to function. And so I think it's really good that we share both versions of how we do things, because I also neurotically meal plan. It's just a different version of being a little bit crazy.
And one last way that we'll give you guys to deal with your eggs is you can also water glass them. That just takes hydrated lime, I think it's called, or pickling lime is what it's commonly referred to, and putting that in jars. We talked about that specifically in our food preservation video, so if you're curious about that, go check it out.
In the realm of chickens, another thing that I recently have come across for the first time is dealing with a ton of chicken all at once, and that's because of my salvage store deal shopping. I feel like I mentioned this in the last one. I got 50 or like 45 pounds of chicken, like whole chickens, for $10, and I needed to do something with all of it. And for me, the solution to that was parting them all out into specific size packages that were going to go into the freezer. I vacuum sealed them, and I made them into packages that were the size for me to make one meal that would last me 3 nights. That's just how I always do things. I try to part them all out because I don't always love having a whole chicken to deal with, mostly because I don't like letting them thaw, because I don't plan that far ahead. Which might sound crazy, like going back on the last thing we just talked about, but I spent a lot of time. I spent an entire day parting out those 12 chickens, and that was a lot more time consuming than I expected it to be. I figured I would be able to just like breeze through them, package them all up.
I'm sure you get fast at it if you're practiced at it, but I deal with that all the time. So the first year and the second year that I was at the homestead, I did at least a couple batches of meat chickens. So I've processed somewhere in the neighborhood of 120-ish chickens here over the last few years. And I'm not doing any this year because I have a freezer full of chicken and I just don't need to do any. But that was a struggle for me. Before homesteading, I was used to just grabbing a package of 3 chicken breasts from the grocery store for the week, and I just get to, cook with that already disassembled piece of protein, and it's super easy. So I struggle with, the whole cooking with the chickens that I have aspect for a few reasons. For one, I'm not really a fan of dark meat, and so I put off dealing with it, and I just am not really practiced at making anything out of it, prior to having to deal with it because I have whole chickens. So what I tend to do is I'll cut the chicken breast out and I will just roast what's left so that I can use it for shredded chicken, because if I don't do that, then it sits in the fridge. And if chicken that I grew here and harvested here goes bad, then I feel terrible about it. I do not want that to happen. So I know myself and I know that I need to cook that immediately. But for me to sit there and break down a whole chicken, it's going to take me forever. And I forget a little bit every time where the joints are. And then I feel like I'm cutting through bone with my chicken or with my kitchen knives. And I get so frustrated, honestly. I would like to avoid, thawing a whole chicken. At this point, I'm a little bit committed because I have a chest freezer full of whole chickens. So it is what it is. But something that I did with the last batch of chickens that I harvested last year was I made myself break them down. And I could not do that in the same day that I harvested them because that is so exhausting physically and emotionally to go through and process 30 chickens. That's usually my batch size, even if I have help. So I had to, keep them in coolers and just do it the next day because there was no way I was going to do it in the same day. But doing that all at once, and then I get, practice with it. I remember where the sockets are, where my knife is supposed to go, and I just put it in Ziploc bags, and then I have that in my freezer, more ready to go. That helps me so much, and I honestly only did it that way last year because I didn't have enough freezer space to put entire chickens away, so there was no option. I had to break them down, but I would totally do that again in my next chicken batch.
I was going to ask you about that and see if you did break them down when you first butchered them, because when I helped Meg and Ben do it, it was a long day. We did 100 chickens. It was me and Ben were eviscerating. The boys were doing some of the other jobs, and Meg was at the killing station and stuff. Like, it was a lot of people helping, but it was 100 chickens in one day. So in the first 4 hours or 3 hours, we did all of the butchering. And then we had lunch and let them sit in the ice coolers. And then afterwards, until like 6 or so p.m., we were cutting them up, parting them out, and vacuum sealing them and everything. And we did 100, like, all at once. And that was so much work, but you kind of got in the flow of it and it started going faster. And I felt the same way when I just parted out all those chickens that I got from the salvage store. As much as I love like a good roast chicken, like Sunday dinner, it's just me eating it. And I know like it's just you eating it. So I wouldn't leave a ton of them whole, honestly, as much as I really love the thought of that. Like, I still would have to make something completely separate for Taylor for dinner. So it just doesn't make sense for me to leave them whole because it's just me eating it for a day or 2 or 3.
And dealing with chickens for meat, there's more than just the muscles. There's the organs. A lot of organs can be turned into dog food if you have a dog, or, some people like to eat the livers and gizzards. That's not my deal. I will never ever do that. But if that sounds appetizing to you, absolutely go for it. Especially if you have raised it and harvested it on your own property. That's probably the cleanest gizzard and liver that you're gonna get. And then there's also the bones. There's the actual carcass, which if you've put in the time and effort to raise it, you probably don't want any of that to go to waste. So that is really easily turned into a broth or a stock, and you can even use, the feet of the chicken to turn into stock. I know that is actually a delicacy in some places.
The salvage store that we go to actually sells chicken paws a lot for really, really cheap. And I'll actually buy them and just keep them in the freezer for whenever I'm going to make broth because it adds a lot of the gelatin to it. Like it gels it up a lot and it just makes it really rich. What do you do with your chicken carcasses after you make broth or stock? Just out of curiosity.
This is probably breaking rules, but I always compost them. If I were super organized, I would put them in a fire and char them, but I'm not super organized, and I don't know if I will ever be super organized. So I don't want any of that to go to waste. I do compost that, and then it breaks down, or it doesn't totally break down, and then it ends up in the garden where it's going to break down one way or another.
I usually just take them out into the woods as far as I can and drop them out there and let something else clean them up for me. It's way too hot, usually, for like half the year to be having campfires here. So I don't want to have a fire, but that is also ideally what I would like to do in the future. So I'm thinking, like, for Thanksgiving, if I do a turkey, I might try and pull out some of the carcasses that I have frozen from those chickens that I just did. And then if I have any from helping the neighbors again, I might try and just do a bunch of broth all at once and then plan on actually having like a fire and making them into bone dust for the garden. You really gotta plan that out.
Yeah, I always plan or intend to do that, and then it just doesn't happen.
Someday it will. Okay, so moving on from chickens, another thing that we have or will have on our homesteads in the future is ruminants, goats, sheep, etc. I don't think either of us plan on having a cow, but never say never. So obviously the dairy aspect is something that you are technically growing on your homestead if you have it. And a lot of the times you're going to be getting so much of that you're going to have to think of other ways to use it rather than just using it in your coffee or drinking it straight. Something that I like to do right now where we don't have a dairy animal yet is I get local milk and I will turn that into yogurt via my Instant Pot. And then usually a gallon ends up making like 5 quarts. Don't ask me how that adds up, but it does. It ends up making 5 quarts of yogurt. And so I just leave a quart or two in my fridge and I freeze the rest of it and I pull it out a couple days before I need it and just let it thaw in the fridge. I use it in smoothies every single day. It's nice and thick and delicious. But another one of the reasons that I really want to get into dairy is because I really like cheese and I really want to experiment with cheese making, and I just think that is such a good way to preserve cheese. It's like to preserve milk. It's the original way to preserve milk, right? And just like turning eggs into pasta dough, I feel like you can't go wrong with always just making more cheese.
Yeah, who's gonna complain about having a ton of really good, high quality cheese? Certainly not me.
And then it just ages if you have too much of it, you just let it keep doing its thing.
Something else you can do with it is you can turn it into desserts like ice cream, or you can also turn it into butter. So you'll get butter and buttermilk from that because the fat will separate from the water and the milk. And then you can even turn around and use the buttermilk, which is pretty watery, in other things. Like, it's great to replace water in bread recipes. It just gives that bread even more depth of flavor. And again, who's gonna complain about having really good bread around the house?
If you have extras, you can always make the bread or biscuits or variations of whatever and freeze that too if you have the space, so that you have easy homemade bread and bakery goods to pull out whenever. And then another thing that I just thought of is I've seen people, if they have way too much milk, they will just feed it to, or their whey, when they're making cheese and stuff, they'll just feed it to their pigs or their chickens. And then there's really no waste in that at all. Like, it's going into meat production, eggs, etc.
Right. And something that I'm excited to try with the sheep milk is sheep milk is supposed to freeze really well. So I'm excited to, have that in the freezer for the off season because sheep are seasonal milkers. I can have my back stock of that and then thaw it as I need it, because I would love that to replace my soy milk. So I drink soy milk not because I'm lactose intolerant or anything. I just like the taste. I'm just weird. At one point I was vegan, and that's just one thing that I never transitioned back into my life was milk. So I go through, I don't know, a half gallon of soy milk in a week. And if I can keep a stash of sheep milk in the freezer and use that in the winter when I'm not able to get milk from them, that would be really cool.
You're gonna need another freezer.
Shh, details. And then something that neither one of us have personal experience with at this point, but is, another aspect of the food cycle and the food source for these sorts of things is harvesting the ruminants that you have for meat. So cows, goats, sheep, those are all fairly common meat sources. And you can do it all at your place, but as far as I've seen, most people, they will usually just hand it over to a professional to have it broken down, to have it, butchered. And then you just get the sealed processed meat back. But something to keep in mind is that you're probably going to get a lot of ground meat back. It's not, it is some steaks, it is some cuts that you're going to have whole, but when you're talking about eating the whole animal and not just picking up the cut that you want at the grocery store when you want it, you do kind of have to think ahead. Similar to, me with my dark meat that I never used to eat on chickens. Think ahead of time what you're going to do with all of that ground meat before you get yourself into that one.
Yeah, that is something that I feel like I never really considered before I helped the neighbors butcher their chickens or filmed their pig butchering workshop. There's a limited set of so many things depending on how many animals you're going to be butchering. Like, you get 2 racks of ribs from a pig. Like, it's not, you could have those every week. There's going to be only so much bacon. I'm using a pig because that as an example, because that's what I watch them do. But like, there's only so much loin, and then like there's certain things you have to choose between cuts if you're only doing one animal. Like, some things at a butcher would get turned into one thing or the other. You can't have both, and you have to choose between those. So that is not something that I've ever really considered, and it's kind of eye-opening, like the amount of one thing that like I could consume, because like I could eat bacon I could eat bacon every single day and never get sick of it, but like that's not a reality if you're just doing like one pig or whatever. And it's the same with your chicken breasts. Like, I also don't love dark meat. I save that and I will put it in soups and other things that it gets into small pieces, because the texture thing for me is so big, and if there are any little bits of other textures in there, I'm not about it. I will not be able to finish my meal if there is a piece of like tendon or something that gets in there. I can't do it. So the dark meat is also hard for me. But it's just something you have to deal with when you have like the whole animal to consider.
Right. Like for me, if I'm in the grocery store and I've decided that I want to have red meat that week, I'm probably going to pick up a top sirloin steak. Maybe I'll pick up a flank steak. Maybe I'll pick up filet mignon. But I really don't deviate from that too much. Very occasionally, I'll grab a pound of ground beef to, make burgers or something else with. But it's certainly not in proportion to what comes from the animal, that's for sure.
I think it would be a really interesting challenge to, like, even if you're buying meat from the store, to only allow yourself, like, for a year, only allow yourself, like, I'd get this many cuts from this animal, and, like, that's how many I would get. Like, I'm not getting more than that, just to see how you would be able to, like, adapt. I feel like that would be a really good way if you're planning to do something like that in the future, like butchering your own animals, like to practice using other cuts. When I was at the pig workshop, they served a whole bunch of different like varieties of things that they make with like all of these weird cuts and extras. Like, I don't even know, like what do they call it? Scrapple? It's like it's called liver mush down here, but it's like a little bit different, I think. She serves scrapple and head cheese and fresh pork rinds. Like, I've never had a pork rind. That was freaking delicious. Like, all of those things were so good. I would never have made them on my own because they look disgusting, but they taste really good. So it's like, you have to be willing to kind of embrace the whole deal if you're going to get into that.
I definitely made myself do that with chickens. You know, when I was super excited about homesteading, but not in a place to actually physically do it, that was one of the first things I did. I was like, all right, I need to make myself cook with a whole chicken. And I did that for a while, and I was like, man, I would really rather just pick up the packet of chicken breast. But, you know, now it's normal to me. Now I know how to handle that. And yes, it is slightly annoying sometimes, but it's been years since I've picked up a 3-packet of chicken breast at the grocery store. So it's pretty cool to shift what your normal is.
You learn as you go, and that is a really good first step, is just like taking a whole chicken and teaching yourself not only how to break it down, but like what to do with every single bit of that thing.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of She Said Homestead. We hope you enjoyed our chat. Before we say goodbye, we'd love to hear from you. Send your homesteading stories to us at shesaidhomestead@gmail.com. We can't wait to share them on the air. To stay connected, follow us on Instagram for updates and sneak peeks at what's coming up next.
If you like video podcasts, make sure you subscribe to the She Said Homestead YouTube channel too. We can't thank you enough for being part of the She Said Homestead community. Until next time, happy homesteading.